He began his dream with only 8 cents in his pocket. But was George F. Johnson's dream of an industrial democracy fully realized? You decide for yourself.
They would arrive in New York City on Sunday, which was the truth. They'd go, which way, EJ?
They heard about, as the saying goes, which way, EJ, when they came to Ellis Island.
My great-grandfather immigrated from Austria-Hungary to Endicott in 1914. After making his start in EJ, he sent for his wife, as well as my grandfather and his 2 brothers. Commonly living with no shoes on their feet, they would soon be working and living in a community of one of the largest shoe concerns in the world. Like most who lived and worked in the area, my family came to this country for work and a new way of life. They moved to this house in Endicott on Roble Avenue to start their new life in America. Most EJ employees were immigrants from Poland, Russia, Ireland, Italy, and Austria-Hungary, which was later Czechoslovakia.
When I went over on the avenue and met Mr. Shapiro, my name was Yassel. And when I would take my lunch to my dad over in the tannery, my name was Yushko. And when I went to school and got out on the ball field after school, with all the guys and the team members, my name was Giuseppe, or Giuseppe. And I said, you know, by golly, I was 14 years old before I found out my name was Joe. And I thought, but it really, and I really meant that I wouldn't have traded, I would not trade my youth and growing up in Endicott for anything in the world.
And all of a sudden, I fall in love with America. I really like it.
What was the unique foundation to an otherwise common story of working and living in industrial America? One of the first things one sees when entering Endicott or Johnson City is the square deal arches over Main Street. In 1920, Endicott-Johnson workers raised $14,000 for each one. Why was it that the local workforce's pride in the company was so great? Born October 14, 1857 in Milford, Massachusetts, George F. Johnson worked since the age of 13 in several typically Horde shoe and boot factories in the area. In 1881, he was thrown out of a factory for talking with an employee.
In 1887, George F. received a forwarded letter from his father. The letter simply stated, Mr. Johnson, Plymouth, Massachusetts. It was from Joe Dimmitt, who was the superintendent of the Leicester Boot Company in Binghamton, New York. Mr. Dimmitt wanted Mr. Johnson to work in the training room of his operations. Thereafter, George F. sent off to Binghamton, New York with only 8 cents in his pocket. Upon arriving and meeting with these group of men, they were expecting to see an older Mr. Johnson. George F. at the time was only 30 years old. So he had to convince these group of gentlemen that he could do the job, he can run and be manager of their operations in the training room. Well, George F. was successful in his attempt and started out as foreman in the Leicester Boot Company. The Lester brothers began to see the great cost savings as George F. rose up through the ranks. George F. was now managing their entire workforce. He then went to Mr. Lester and recommended they move to rural areas where the employees could have houses with large gardens and large yards and be close to the factories. The Lester brothers took this suggestion and expanded west of Binghamton, which became known as Leicestershire and which is now known as Johnson City. and began to see the benefits of their move.
George F.'s ideals for the working class was beginning to come true, but not completely. Mr. Lester was selling land to employees at a profit.
The trouble with most employers is that they don't see far enough ahead. If they did, if they had real vision, they'd see that they would be better off paying good wages and helping their workers to lead normal, happy lives, owning their own homes and being a real part of the community. But the short-sighted employers want to make quick money, and they think they can get it by paying as little as possible, exploiting their workers and the people who buy their product.
Already George was stating his beliefs in hopes that one day he might live up to truly fulfilling his dream for the working people.
During the Depression of the 1890s, a savvy Boston businessman named Henry B. Endicott, who was also a leather supplier to the Lester brothers, obtained controlling interest in their company. At the same time, George F. expressed interest in running their entire operation. On the advice of Mr. Lester, who could see George F.'s potential, advised Mr. Endicott in letting him do so. Hesitantly, Henry B. Endicott let George F. run the entire operation of business. In this experimental time, George F. managed his company as though each employee was his friend and equal. He thought by maintaining a close relationship with his employees, it would be easier for him to implement his new policies and procedures. One of his first new policies was the piecework system. This piecework system gave his employees an incentive and also increased production in his factories. He even rid his 2 salesmen of their positions and went on the road himself and talked to corporate heads and told them of the price advantage and the quality of shoes he had to offer to them.
In 1899, after reviewing the increased sales and decreased costs, Henry Endicott offered George F. a raise. George F. declined, but offered to buy half the business on an IOU to Mr. Endicott for $150,000 at 6% interest, payable quarterly. Endicott agreed, knowing that they both had made a good deal. The result was called the Endicott-Johnson Company. George F. could now start living his dream. With business solid and cost-effective, he governed by the golden rule, managing from the employee's perspective in an industrial democracy. After convincing Henry Endicott of his plan, the expansion began. Headlines read, "Model City of Endicott will be built opposite Casino Park in the town of Union, an industrial movement of the stupendous magnitude." He built factories and 75 homes on 15 acres for the workers on the south side of town known as Endicott Terrace, back in 1904. These homes were not the typical small company shanties of low quality and similar appearance. They were 6- and 7-room homes of individual design with lawns and space for gardens. The homes were sold at cost to employees for just over $3,000. George F. saw the benefits of satisfied employees. Business flourished with soaring production and sales, and E.J. kept expanding. George F. not only integrated his workers within the company, but he integrated his industry to eliminate middleman costs. Near the turn of the century, he bought the Weed Tannery in Binghamton and began to perfect the art of tanning leather. He then moved on to build the sole leather and upper leather tanneries, which were later followed by the calfskin, chrome, and sheepskin tanneries. And nearly 30 factories would be built, combined with several other facilities that supported manufacturing. In addition, George F. started integrating his family members into the business. His son George W. started in the tanneries. George F.'s brother C. Fred had been integral in many aspects of the business, and later his son Charles F. Jr. started in the shipping department. With an integrated hoof-to-foot industry and the support of integrated working partners and family, E.J. was well on its way to tremendous success. E.J.'s history isn't just the building of an empire, it's about the building of a lasting foundation of relationships where capital honored labor. George F. knew most of his employees personally and visited facilities often. As a former bench worker, he recognized the importance of satisfied labor to cure the ills of industrial production.
George F. come out with the first 8-hour days. I don't know if anybody knew that. He began the first 8-hour days, first company in the country.
In October 1916, George F. sent out a memo that plainly announced, starting Monday, Endicott-Johnson employees will work an 8-hour day. Until then, they had worked 9.5-hour days when the industry standard was 11 hours. When word spread, employees gathered up their families and friends, got some clams, beer, and a band, and proceeded to George F.'s house. 25,000 people dropped by to thank George F. personally. A parade with thousands of workers with signs organized in appreciation of the reduced hours. George F. knew that the people would do more and better work in an 8-hour day and be of greater service to themselves, their families, the community, and humanity at large. He was right, and production reached a new high with the shorter hours. EJ finally incorporated in 1919 for $36 million, of which Henry B. Endicott and George F. Johnson became worth over $10 million each. With the money, George F. gave back to who made the success, his working partners. Endicott decided to create a large estate for him and his family to enjoy. Within a year, Henry Endicott died, and George F. took over as president of the Endicott-Johnson Corporation. He was now free from the second-guessing and hesitations that slowed his expansion, integration, and generosity of the past, thus making the Triple Cities a miniature promised land, economically and ethically. By the time of incorporation, EJ employed 13,000 workers and made 75,000 pairs of shoes a day. George F. knew that to be able to do what he wanted for the working man, he was going to have to make a profit, and did. But he also wanted to give them a square deal of the benefits from the product they made. EJ paid their workers the highest rates in the shoemaking industry, but they could afford to. The country was in a sales economy then, and EJ promised a better shoe for less money. Their sales boomed in this practically minded market. EJ was also the first to develop company-owned retail stores to compete with the retailers that bought from middlemen. And as production soared, George F. could not possibly keep up his face-to-face communications with his employees. However, he always maintained an open-door policy where anyone could walk right into his office and be able to speak their mind without any fear. With the rapid expansion, George F. had to develop his public speaking abilities. He commonly would address employees in a plant or outside in an open area. In addition, he developed a weekly internal communications magazine called the EJ Workers Review. In it was stories of the company's improvements, benefits explanations, and coverage of events relevant to employees' lives. It was also a forum to discuss employee questions or problems. Letters were answered directly from George F. In later years, George F. transformed the internal communications magazine into 1 to 2 full pages in the daily Binghamton newspaper. Known as the EJ Page, everyone in the Triple Cities would learn of the wonders George F. was making with his working partners. George F. could afford to do this because he owned half the newspaper, but later sold it to Congressman William Hill. Hill spun off the Johnson City Publishing Company from the Binghamton paper, and the company printed all of EJ's publications and piecework coupons.
The EJ Page in the newspaper, there was always anybody's birthday. In fact, when my nephew was just a year old, George Pennell was the photographer. And anytime you had a party, or he'd come and take a picture. That's who took all of these pictures. George Pennell took all of these pictures. And no matter what, all you had to do is call George, and he'd come and take pictures, and you'd get glossy prints. It was fantastic. And the EJ Workers page had any news about any of the EJ workers.
No matter what the occasion was, there's a picture in the paper of it. Either somebody had a big birthday party or a wedding or something, you know. It was full, two full pages every morning, morning sun. Matter of fact, they used to send, during the war years, while I was in service, they used to send all the servicemen that were EJ workers the daily paper for all the while they was in service. Every day got the morning paper.
In the early days, George also had a lust for money and wealth. He later realized that he wasn't satisfied with wealth, but with its only justifiable use, the betterment of the human race. In realizing the importance of making a profit, George F. never forgot the source and always gave labor a square deal. He instantly initiated a shared surplus earning program, putting employees to work for themselves. Whatever was left over after paying the company's liabilities was split equally between labor and holders of common stock.
If there is any surplus, it is split 50-50 between the common stockholders who have taken the financial risks and the workers who have produced the results. There are no big profits, therefore, split among a few people. There are no families who divide the earnings.
Letters came in from every department expressing their gratitude.
Our own Mr. George F. We feel that mere words from us are indeed inadequate, too empty, to express our sincere thanks and appreciation for the wonderful opportunities of sharing in the surplus profits.
If we had a good year, they always made sure that they give you a little bonus, whether it was only $50 or $100 or sometimes as much as $200 or $300. And that was a great thing that always came about. He always made sure that when we had a good year, everybody else had a good year.
George F. was a believer in spreading the wealth. The greatest good for the greatest number was his motto. Every employee received the exact same bonus, including the president and his son George W., the vice president. At its highest, the bonus was $245, which translated into almost $5 a week. In September of 1919, employees congregated at Ideal Park and formed the first of what would be a tradition, a celebration named George F. Day. At this event, Congressman William Hill addressed the congregation about George F.'s philosophy on labor issues, citing an interesting story of a recent buyout offer of $45 million.
Gentlemen, this is a great deal of money. It is more money than this business can pay returns on. Since we have been in business, we have tried to do two things. We have tried to give the greatest possible wage and the best working conditions to our fellow workers, and we have tried to put into the goods we make all the honest value that it is possible to put into them. If you put $45 million into this business, you will have to make the business pay dividends on this vast sum of money. It is possible to pay dividends on $45 million, but it can be done only by undoing all that we have spent a lifetime trying to do. I will not consider the proposition. I am going back to Johnson City and Endicott to try to make life easier and happier instead of harder for the boys and girls there.
Congressman Hill also stated how George F. was different from most industrialists by not taking advantage of his workers, but giving back to them and the community. George F.'s benefits programs were now at full throttle. He was not only expanding facilities at an astounding rate, but he was funding the building of homes, medical clinics and hospitals, parks, public markets, churches, and more. Knowing the importance of protecting all that he had worked to build up, George F. commissioned his brother C. Fred to start what would be one of the most sophisticated private fire brigades in the world. Once established, Chief James R. Eldridge took over. Along with the safety and security departments, the EJ Fire Prevention Department was integrated into the corporate culture. All factories were equipped with automatic sprinkler systems and inside standpipes. Large areas were separated with fire doors. Hose houses and hydrants were located at strategic points outside the buildings. The department also shared responsibility with the village for putting out fires in workers' homes. In exchange, the village helped the EJ Fire Prevention Department if any facility fire needed more help. Another responsibility the department had was the delivery of worker payroll. EJ paid their employees weekly in cash. Armed fire prevention employees delivered the cash salaries to all employees. During the Depression, when they were robbed, the department purchased armored cars. Prior to 1943, the EJ Fire Prevention Department was also in charge of the ambulance squad that served the employees and their families. In 1943, the ambulances were placed under the control of Ideal Hospital and Wilson Memorial Hospital. The fire prevention departments were located in Endicott and Johnson City, totaling 115 full-time employees. Even more important than the post-event loss control was the department's responsibility of prevention. George F. knew the value of risk control and implemented it long before the mainstream. All EJ facilities were built with approval from EJ's fire science experts. Each building was patrolled at night with hourly reports on alarm system tests and facility conditions. Fire prevention employees were tested on their weekly training sessions about new techniques and facility updates. They were also trained in resuscitation. Extinguishers and first aid boxes were spread throughout the factories. EJ employees were trained on what to do in an emergency. In fact, 70 to 90% of all EJ fires were extinguished by employees without even having to call the fire prevention department. When there was an emergency, EJ workers were trained to know what to do, and there were frequent fire drills to test the workers' responsibilities. Losses from 1926 to 1930 were only $3,000 a year, much lower than any other manufacturing facility of this size. George F. was known as a golden rule capitalist who felt that capital was an empty and brainless thing that couldn't live for a minute without labor. His attempt to make the most of instead of the most out of the business allowed him to give back in so many ways more than is or could be covered in the following minutes.
You can talk from now doomsday for what EJ meant to this town and to the people. This whole town revolved around Endicott-Johnson back then. They built all these homes. They paid what, maybe $2,000-3,000 for the house, and they took the payments out of your paycheck. And if you couldn't afford the payment that week, you just went to payroll and you skipped a payment. It's difficult you can't even imagine what EJ did for their people.
George F. knew that his workforce family had families and that they needed food, shelter, safety, and a healthy lifestyle. EJ's home building program that started in 1904 was satisfying a critical need. George F. built homes in towns surrounding the factories. He also believed in management living with labor in Harbany. The Johnsons were invited to and attended many family parties and gatherings, mingling with everyone and enjoying their customs. George F. built his home in 1903 on Broad Street in downtown Endicott. In a letter to his daughter Lillian, George F. stated,
"The people we don't love is the people we don't know. These are the ones who go to private schools when young, who live in exclusive homes and exclusive circles, and don't mingle with their kind, the human family."
What he taught me was to respect other people, respect other people's property, number one, which is a word that's not in the vocabulary of the people of today. You see it around all the time, people destroying other people's property. And kindness to others. That they probably, he used to say, unless you have walked in their shoes, you don't know what their life is like. And it's a very true saying. And he just tried to help everybody that he possibly could, and he was a friend to all. I don't know of anybody that disliked him, because he was so warm, and he was so enormous as far as I was concerned. His hands were humongous. Of course, little girl putting her hand in Grandpa's hands. With me, he was just Grandpa, and we'd hold hands and walk out in the gardens, and we'd just talk about the flowers or whatever happened to come into his mind. I remember one story. He dressed up, it was in the summertime, and he had on the white pants, wool, I don't know why, but in a navy blue jacket, all dressed up for dinner. And we went out to sit on a bench under the trees and wait until we were called to the table. Sat down on the bench. It was a cement bench, and the cement bench decided at that time to break in the middle. And down we went, and there he was with his white pants on, getting all grass stained, scrambling to get up. You didn't know that he was the head of this big company. No, he just was warm and gentle, firm.
Then he'd drive about 20 miles an hour. If you got over that, he'd tell you about it. You went too fast, But then he would talk. I never paid much attention to what they said because, well, none of my business. But now I wish I had kind of took notes, because I could have, made a good, interesting story about it. Or you wouldn't go over 20 miles from Endicott, 25, yeah.
And
just a country road, that's right. Just right around, just get out and get away from the house.
Them days, you wouldn't see a car go down the street. Maybe about once a day, possibly twice a day, a car going down the street. Us kids would use the street, the whole street is just playground. We'd be playing ball and everything, whatever, the kids would be playing. And Mr. George F. Johnson used to come up practically every day, ride up the street with his pet bulldog. He'd get out of the car and play with us kids, stick his hand in his pocket, pull out a handful of change, throw it in the air and scramble around, watch the kids scrambling for it. He really enjoyed seeing that. He really enjoyed seeing that.
But as kids, we remember we played in the street, and George F. Johnson, at least once a week, would come by in his big touring car and drive down the streets and down the street and wave to us kids, and we were all so excited about that kind of a personal thing, you know. And we were the last street in Endicott at the time. And but how exciting that was.
While EJ's expansion of factories occurred, the home building program, headed by George F's brother Harry L. Johnson, was hard-pressed to keep up with the demand. As a result, many people were being victimized by greedy land sharks in the area. When an employee and his family died in a fire of an old tenement, George F. felt responsible.
We have no right to build these plants until we build safe and comfortable homes. We were so eager to make profits in a complete plant that we forgot about the homes, but we are trying to make up for it now.
He immediately stepped up the home building program. In a letter to his brother C. Fred in the spring of 1923, George F. stated,
"This morning we have decided to build about 100 small garages. We can build about one every day. Then we will rent these for, say, $2 or $3 a month to families who are willing to live in them, rather than pay the big rent that the landlords get. The plan is a good one, because then we can tell the families who are waiting for the new homes that they can have these garages to live in on the back of their lot and occupy their houses early in the fall."
They built homes for all the workers. This is an EJ home we're living in. $3,200, a home like this at that time. And they would deduct a few dollars a week out of your pay to pay for the home. Everything was made convenient for the workers. Everything was for the workers.
Now, Endicott-Johnson afforded them a good family life. George F. Johnson knew this. He knew the importance of family to people who came from Europe. So he provided all of these things for them. For example, the house. This house was, let's see, my parents moved in 1924, and they were the first ones to move into this house, and we're still in this house.
The houses that were built were of excellent quality, unlike the typical flimsy company shanties popular of the era. They were roomy, solid houses, all of unique design, and they stand as a testament of their quality to this day. Homes were built on a lot of 50 by 150 feet, with plenty of room for a garage and garden.
The vegetables were grown right in the garden. This area behind me here, my father had that total garden, and we canned hundreds of quarts of tomatoes and peaches and pickles and peppers and all that right from the garden.
There were three basic architectural themes from which each individually designed home was based off of: the bungalow, the foursquare, and the homestead. These 6 to 8 room homes had full plumbing and wiring, included large master bedrooms with walk-in closets, hardwood flooring, laundry chutes, pantries, and built-in bookshelves. They were sold at cost to employees for $2,500 to $3,500. Over 4,000 homes were built by EJ for employees. The house my family immigrated to was an EJ home, as was my grandfather's brother's home, which still stands at 631 Wilma Street in West Endicott. In a letter to President Roosevelt, George F. commented,
"The homes we've built in this valley are plenty good enough for you or me to live in."
My father-in-law was a master plasterer and bricklayer. And these are the kinds of people that they had working for them, people that had come from Europe, and in Europe they were masters of their job, you know. And they worked for Endicott-Johnson, and the workmanship was very, very nice.
It ain't only that we earn more money and the shops are better to work in, but we have a chance to live in real homes, not jammed in the rows of sloppy old houses. I've made a good start at buying a home. In a few years, it'll be mine. I'll tell you one thing. In this place, you feel that you are somebody, not a dumb factory hand to be hired and fired and kicked around. It's a living, that's what it is.
Residents of the area are very proud of their EJ homes. Their endurance through the years is a testament to their pride and the quality of the homes. The home building process was also as integrated as could be made. Even the paint used on the houses was made from a byproduct of leather. With their own lumberyard and mechanical department, the homes were built by workers that were paid as EJ employees and were eligible for the same benefits as the regular EJ employee. E.J. also built the majority of the early roads, sewers, sidewalks, and street lighting for Endicott. George F.'s brother, C. Fred, was responsible for the planning and naming of Endicott streets, mostly named after U.S. presidents.
In the height of E.J. home building plans, the superintendent of the home construction gang told Mr. George F. one day, he says, Mr. Johnson, I don't know what I'm going to do. He says, I can't keep enough wheelbarrows on my job here. He says, they steal them. George F. says, oh, don't worry a bit. He says, when they all get one, they'll stop.
He'd say, well, when they get all they want, they'll have them. Same with the lumber. And they built homes and garages and everything up there.
He always would feed anybody that came to the back door, and in those days, they called them bums. Well, today they don't call them that. I mean, they were bums, but they weren't bad people. They were homeless, as they are today. And if they were fed until they were full, whatever was on our table.
And they had the market. There was a market on McKinley Avenue, like a farmer's market, more or less. And my mother, all the ladies used to go there and buy their food.
Providing another basic need by protecting his workers from the rising food prices of World War I, George F. established farmers markets. John S. Patterson Market in Johnson City and the Workers' Public Market in Endicott was where employees and the public were able to buy their produce for up to 35% cheaper than store prices.
I worked there for a while too, for one produce dealer. Before I went to work for E.J., I worked there for a couple of years. And then after I got to even work for E.J., I used to help the guy on Saturdays. On Saturdays, worked there, yeah. Sell produce, fruits and vegetables.
Vegetable, fruit, and they have chicken over there. And then we stopped to the American store, was American store over there. We had everything.
E.J. Workers' Co-op stores, also known as the American stores, were established to lower employees' cost of living by providing a discount on other grocery items. In addition to providing public farmers markets and grocery stores, E.J. established a total of 5 factory-located workers' diners. For 15 to 25 cents, depending on the year, one could get a full meal for less than it would cost to make it yourself. Many employees and area residents took advantage of this treat, and mothers were glad to escape their hot kitchens in the summer to enjoy the food, as well as cool drinks and ice cream. It was not uncommon to serve up to 7,000 meals collectively each day. The diners were also open to those who couldn't pay and gave away over 250,000 free meals during the Depression.
And the diner, of course, the E.J. Diner. You could get a meal for 50 cents. And they had bread. They had the bread that they baked there. It's 5 cents a loaf.
You walk along your plate and they put the potatoes on like that, the vegetable or the meat onto it. And I forget where they collected at the end or the beginning. Well, anyway, they collect quarter, it was.
But anybody was welcome. Anything that E.J. did was for the community. They didn't say just E.J. workers or 15 cents for a full course dinner. 15 cents for a full course dinner. Eat all you want. Seconds or thirds if you want it. And I don't mean to throw stones or anything, but about half of the people there were IBM workers. And
they give you enough food for 25 cents. Was no complaining on that.
Our husbands eat such good American dinners at the E.J. restaurants that they don't like our country dishes anymore. If only we could learn to cook American.
In response to women wanting to learn how to be more American, the Ideal Training School was established to teach women how to decorate, clean, sew, and cook.
And Mrs. Johnson, and I could almost picture her. I remember her. She sponsored this sewing classes for young girls. And I went for 4 years. And I made my own graduation dress. And when we graduated, they had a ceremony. And Mrs. Johnson gave all of us that graduated a $20 gold piece.
Knowing that healthy employees were productive employees, George F.'s son, George W., set up a small infirmary in the Sole Leather Tannery office in 1917 to treat industrial injuries. Then, in realizing the benefits of early treatment and healthy employees, George F. made a comprehensive medical plan that was extended to all employees free of charge, a first of its kind. Clinics were set up in Binghamton, Johnson City, and Endicott. George F. encouraged employees to use the services before getting ill, a preventative medicine philosophy and predecessor to the HMO.
And then, of course, when they'd come to the medical, they couldn't talk to the doctor. Now, the girls that were the regulars couldn't understand them, so they send them down to me. So I'd start in. Come ti chiami, ando abiti. Oh, they go, my God, like this. Oh, Benedica, God bless you. You can talk Italian. The Italian nurse, infermiera means nurse, okay? So all of those questions that they had to answer, I would tell them in Italian. So I filled that out in no time. They were thrilled that I could talk to them in Italian. Then, of course, we would give the okay at the employment office. They would be hired. So they had to work like for 6 months. Then they were eligible. Many of them surprised us, who we thought were going to be good, robust, healthy people. Turned out the minute that they were entitled, they were there all the time. If a worker was happy with a doctor, he or she stuck with him. She didn't, or he didn't change and come one day to the doctor that was on 8 to 10 and the next day to the one that was on 10 to 12 or whatever. Whatever time, they would either call or they would know when the doctor was going to be there. My doctor is there 10 to 12, so he would say to the foreman, I've got to go to the medical, and he would let him go. And that was another nice thing. You didn't have to beg, okay? You were allowed to go. And it was go and then come back to their job. They could come to the medical before it got bad. They knew they could come if they were short of money or whatever. They knew they could come and be taken care of. And to me, that's preventive medicine before anything gets out of hand or it gets worse.
Don't wait until you are sick. If you do not feel just right, if you have a slight injury, go to the medical department. Quick intelligence service answering the slightest need prevents illness. They want you to do it. A long spell of sickness means an awful expense.
The medical, the first time I remember, it was on Washington Avenue. Then they built the medical over on North Street. But I remember in that building on Washington Avenue, there was the dentist, the gynecologist, where babies were born and everything.
The building itself was quite old. And yeah, they did have an elevator. You had to go way down the hall, and then the elevator took you upstairs. Or you had all these floors to climb up to the specialty offices.
And so here at the new medical building, they had an elevator right at the foyer, did they?
Yeah. You came in the main floor, and you just veered left, stayed right there, and like where that door is, there's your elevator, and the pharmacy was across from there, and then the lab was down the hall. It was a little easier. It was a little easier for patients. Nice facility, very clean. They kept it clean. They had the best doctors there. That now you go to the waiting, and you didn't have to wait that long at the medical. Now you wait, you sit there, and you sit there, and you sit there. We never had that.
Every time you go, they'd give you a shot.
Yeah.
And then they give you a little bag of those green pills.
Pills,
The green pills were good for everything.
The cure-all, the green pills.
They used to have these green tablets that were like a cure-all, like Tylenol would be today. And you'd get a nice envelope full of these green pills, and and you used them for everything.
And you took 2 of them. I remember the dosage was 2. It was a grade 5, so 2 of them was grade 10.
They used to have doctors making house calls also. They'd make house calls. You didn't have to, if you couldn't get down to the medical for some reason or another, they'd have house calls for you.
With a staff of over 100 medical personnel, services were comprehensive. What couldn't be handled at the clinics were sent to area hospitals, which the Johnsons were pivotal in creating. In 1927, George F. purchased the Wilson Memorial Hospital and gave it to a managing board outside the company. C. Fred built the nurses' dormitory for Wilson. Mrs. George F. donated $100,000 to build a nurses' dormitory for Binghamton General Hospital. George F. built the Ideal Hospital in Endicott, which was judged to be one of the best hospitals between Buffalo and New York City. In memory of her sister, Mrs. George F. donated $125,000 to build a dormitory for nurses who worked there.
Illness comes to all, and the best way to treat it is by free hospitalization of the very best quality, giving each the best opportunity to recover their health and take their place in the world, upright on both feet, ready for work.
At Ideal, I specialed for 2 years, special duty. And the quality of nursing care there was exceptional. The nursing was how I was taught in training. It was patient care, bedside care, which there isn't too much of that anymore. It was so patient care from, say we got assigned 6, 7, 8 patients. We took care of them from the morning till we left at night. Treatment, medication, everything. We knew that patient.
And during that time I was working over there, I had some operation. I go to the hospital. After the operation, they keep you there, a couple of weeks until you was able to be on your own, Everything was covered, medication, doctor, hospital. They really give you all the medication you need. If I have to pay all that, my husband, may rest in peace, he was a very sick man. And he died for cancer, a lot of pain too. And they really took care of him. He was in the hospital 5 months.
If we didn't have that medical coverage that we needed, we would have been totally destroyed, and a lot of other families would have been too. To be hospitalized for 15 months straight and not to have to pay for it was incredible.
And if they had a health problem, they would actually send them, if they couldn't get the results done here, they would give them an airplane ticket, send them to New York City, and because that happened to me. I was sent to New York City, plane tickets and spending money.
But these boys here, none of them, I say, work full-time for EJ, all these boys. They work summer vacations and things like that, just a little off and on. They're happy to get a job at a time they could, just for a little spare money, One of the boys was going to Albany State Teachers College at the time, and he got stricken with appendicitis. He had an appendectomy operation. Well, what are we going to do now, So I went over to see our friends the Johnsons and told them the situation, told them what and got a brother up in Albany with an emergency appendix operation. Is there any chance of getting any help on it? They took care of it all. Imagine that, took care of it all.
In addition, all expenses for EJ workers' babies, including pre- and postnatal, were covered by the company.
At that time, any new mother was given a $20 gold piece. These are going way back now. There's no, and the baby was given $10 plus its first layette of clothes. And then they had a visiting nurse. They used to come to see the mother and baby after the mother got home from the hospital. And then they was eligible for medical care the rest of their life. In the years before EJ started having maternity hospital care, there was a midwife that used to take care of all those newborn babes in town, coming to town. And she lived down Roble Avenue also. She was a widow down the foot of Roble Avenue from where we live there.
Not this 1 day, 2 day stuff after you have a baby, you're out. Rose used to say a week. In fact, she used to get bored, and the doctor would come and say, You can stay another week. You can stay another 2 weeks if you want. The medical payments weren't that high. In fact, the room was only like $6 a night. So what would be another $30 on a paid by EJ medical bill? But Rose would get, no, she wanted to come home with her babies.
Every employee and his family were covered for life. EJ also established a convalescent home at Wagner Farm and a TB clinic at Saranac Lake. There was also a sick relief fund set up for employees. Workers paid 25 cents a week to belong to the Sick Relief Association. And if they were too sick to work, employees received $12 a week. During the Depression, the medical benefits program was approaching a cost of $1 million. At that time, George W., under direction of George F., had to deduct 5% from all wages and salaries to help pay for the medical that was always paid for by profits. The following year, profits increased, and EJ repaid the 5% deduction back to its employees without a reduction in services.
After Mr. Johnson gave me my father's job there in the tannery, because I wanted to make more money to support this big family, he also told me that all your brothers and sisters can have a job here anytime they want to. And he said, and your mother also will have free medical care the rest of her life, which she did. She had free medical care till her death, till about 1959, I guess, and my father got killed in 34. So that's 30-some years. That's 30-some years of free medical care for the mother without anybody working there now.
Retirement ages and pensions were never standardized. Each case was handled individually. When a person who worked at EJ a long time could no longer work, the amount that person needed to get by, if any, was given to them for a pension. Widowed families were also given as much as they needed for as long as they needed. The company also paid the funeral expenses for employees and their families. Truly, EJ workers were cared for from the cradle to the grave. George F. was a man of great vigor. His idea for maintaining health was preventative. He believed in the benefits of exercise and was a great lover of sports.
He loved sports of all kinds, and he had up over the garage, he had his sports room, and it was a huge fireplace and a great big room, and in every chair was a spittoon, because in those days they would either smoke and they'd always have to spit somewhere. So he had them all around, the fireplace was going, and they'd go up there and listen to the different games with his cronies, as he called them. The other room was a exercise room, where he had the sweat box, which I used to sit in thinking, oh, I could lose a lot of weight. Well, you did. You perspired profusely. You couldn't move because it was all electric bulbs sticking out on each side of you, all around your back, and so you sat very still till you flipped off the lights and then opened up the doors and came out. Then he had an electric chair, which it looked exactly like an electric chair, and you put the button on, and you sat there, and it just jiggled you. It just, vibrated like that. I don't know what that was supposed to do. He evidently thought that it was supposed to do something. Then you had the other, I call it the wiggle strap that you strapped on behind you, and it made you go back and forth like that. Again, I suppose to tone your muscles. Down in Florida, we would have to get up in the morning at 6 o'clock and go down to the beach to go swimming. Well, you'd go down before the sun had come up. And of course you were, rather annoyed to be pulled out of your warm bed. But he believed in exercise. So in order to get warm, he and the other gentlemen, they would throw what they called a medicine ball around to get warmed up. And the ladies and the children would kind of just walk very rapidly up and down the beach until the sun started coming up out of the water. I remember looking at that sun, and it looked like it actually was dripping water as it came to the end of, rising up. Then we'd go swimming for about an hour, and then back home to have breakfast, and I'd go off to school.
George and his family particularly loved baseball. 3 workers were taken from the bench to manage factory baseball teams. 2 employees were even offered positions as pro ball players and refused the offer to continue to work for EJ. Games were limited to 5 innings so as not to tire out employees. They played at Johnson Field, built by C. Fred in 1913. The field was even equipped with lights for night games. George F. even owned the Binghamton Triplets Ball Club for a while. The triplets were a farm team for the New York Yankees. George F. would buy out the entire stadium and hold E.J. nights for all employees to come and watch the game for free. Many celebrities graced the audiences at Johnson Field, including Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, and Joe DiMaggio. George F. later sold the ball team because he did not want to be known as an owner of men that were used as commodities. George F. remained very close friends with the commissioner of baseball, Judge Mountain Landis. Commissioner Landis covered the World Series circuit with George F. and selected members of his family.
If he really wanted to see, like, the World Series, he would rent a railroad car or several, depending on how many people wanted to go, and take them down to New York or wherever the series was held, and he would put them up in hotels, and they would stay for the series and then come back home by a railroad car. And my mother and her best friend were the only two women permitted on those cars because they were very much into sports themselves. And she, being brought up like a boy, she had to know all the answers to all the sports and all the names.
Another way that George ensured the health of his employees was to provide athletic facilities and recreation areas. The most popular was Ideal Park, later named Enjoy Park, which previously was the site of an unkept, profit-making area named Casino Park. E.J. spent over $250,000 modernizing the park for all to enjoy free of charge. It was considered one of the best parks in the country.
No matter where you go, you have to pay to get into a park. And he didn't believe in that. He just felt that they worked hard enough and they deserved to have some playtime, free. And that's why the carousels, the 6 carousels that are here are that way. They're in the stipulation that came down. Nobody is ever to be charged.
The only thing you had to pay for was if you wanted food or refreshments. One of the most fascinating features was the large, in-the-ground, million-gallon pool. Built in 1920, it became an attraction that everyone frequented.
I can remember the old park down in Union with a gigantic kidney-shaped swimming pool, concession stands, locker rooms.
Here I'd be swimming all day in a park that didn't cost me a dime. They used to give you a little locker and they'd give you a little identifying marker that you put on your ankle, and you had a locker free all day. And my brother-in-law, who used to work in that tannery, he used to tell me, now if you want to ride home, you listen for the whistles. They used to blow whistles like crazy here. Every time when it's getting ready to come home, they'd blow a whistle. When it was time to quit, they'd blow a whistle. When it was lunch hour, they blew a whistle. And the whole valley heard it. And he said that if you wanted to ride home, and I know you're going to get yourself tired out swimming all day, you just listen for the 3:45 whistle. And the next whistle is when I'm leaving at 4 o'clock. Well, I was just enjoying myself in that pool. I heard those whistles and I just didn't pay any attention to them. I said to myself, oh, I'll get home. But it was quite a distance from the pool to North McKinley Avenue where my brother-in-law and my sister lived. And then it was the same old story. You know, I'd come home all pooped out. Where were you? Didn't you want to ride home? No. You're tired out. No.
During the 20s, people enjoyed the horse races that were held at the Ideal Racetrack, a stop on the Orange County Circuit.
We sat there and get pencils, and bet pencils on the horses. Yeah, I was 7, 8, probably 12, 14 years old at 15. Yeah. Oh, that's a beautiful. Eddie Old Guy was one of them, a racer. He was a champion, And they had then the big old buildings for the horses, and they had Orange County Circuit races. That's what part of it. See, they come there, like in the summertime for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks for those races.
Do you remember in the wintertime what they would do?
Oh, they would
flood the football field, freeze it. They would have big bonfires. Big bonfires in the wintertime so the people could go ice skating. They'd come out and huddle around the bonfire, and it's great. Good times.
The park was located along the Susquehanna River, where many enjoyed a peaceful ride.
Then they used to have canoes there, too. They had a place where the canoes were on the river. Oh, the river's beautiful.
The 36-acre park had vast picnic grounds, covered picnic areas, 4 tennis courts, a baseball diamond that was also used as a football field in the fall, and a carousel, another favorite.
One time he wanted to get on the merry-go-round and he didn't have the 5 cents to ride it. And he says, if I ever get to be anything, I'm going to give kids merry-go-rounds rides free.
I remember riding on the carousels every day. We'd walk over to the park when we were small and have our turn on the carousel and jump off and run around and get back on again as quickly as we can. Sometimes Sam would let us stay on if he didn't catch us. But otherwise we'd have to run out one gate, run around, get in line again, and jump on our favorite horse.
The old casino building was used as a roller rink and a house for shows and many other activities like boxing matches that drew large crowds.
That was a very popular spot. All the young teenagers put on their roller skates and skated to the music.
And one thing Dad liked to do was he used to like to watch the fights. And one thing that EJ even used to do down at Enjoy Park or Ideal Park, they had a thing called a casino. It was a big round building. They used to have roller skating and so forth. But once a week or once every couple of weeks, the EJAA, which is the EJ Athletic Association, would sponsor boxing matches for amateur boxers. And he would take me down there. We'd sit up in the bleachers in there and we'd watch these guys fight.
It also had 2 bandstands where, on Sunday nights, the EJ Workers Band and Chorus performed many company pride songs and the old faves, a special treat, especially before the era of radio.
That was a great thing. That was great entertainment every Sunday evening, Oh, yes. You wouldn't miss that, no how. Go down to the park and stand there and listen to Mr. Frank Tay play his kind. Oh, that was real nice. That was a real nice concert.
Everybody went. They'd bring blankets and spread them out on the grass. Yeah, oh my God. Frank Tay, he passed away a long time ago. But the concerts, I'm telling you, any goings on that were in this town were due to EJ.
One such celebration was the Labor Day celebration.
I do have fond memories of Endicott-Johnson. I used to take the kids down to the Labor Day celebration and picnics galore.
Everybody walked down to the park because there was no place, where could you park? Half of Endicott, 3/4 of Endicott would be there, plus Johnson City and everybody else.
Do you remember going down on Labor Day?
Labor Day.
How EJ used to sponsor the Labor Day events down at Enjoy Park? Wow.
They'd have like a circus or a carnival or a rodeo. I remember they'd have a rodeo every once in a while.
High wire acts and trapeze artists. They would have a grease pole down at one end with a $10 or $20 bill.
That was earlier. That was early in the morning. They used to have all kind of games for the kids. I entered one of them one time. I entered a pie eating contest because the pie looked so good that I entered the contest. I wanted to have some pie. I never won, but I had a lot of blueberry pie all over my face.
They used to have bubble blowing contests.
Baton twirling.
Yeah.
I remember that. All these different things.
And then at night they'd have the big pyrotechnic show, big fireworks, and they'd be set up along the river, and we'd get there real early while it was still light and put our blankets out on the football field. And then they'd fire the fireworks, and we'd be right underneath them when they came out. That soot would fall all over your face.
Hot dogs used to be 5 cents over there. Big glass of root beer you couldn't even hold in your hand, about as big as a barrel for a nickel.
Man, that was Labor. I had a gas station and I had a popcorn machine, and to get 150 pound of popcorn, I'd sell it in one day. 5 cents a bag. Now that's a lot of popping.
George W. Johnson Park was built in 1927 on Oak Hill Avenue in Endicott's north side.
We lived right across the street from the George W. Johnson Park. And in 1934, they dedicated the carousel in the George W. Johnson Park. And the kids ran there from far and wide. And George F. and George W. were there. I'm sitting right there next to him. He sat right down on the ground with the rest of us kids. It was such a big thrill to have that carousel in the park. The park was there. and they had a children's swimming pool, and it was a big celebration. And when they rededicated it, 1934 to 1994, it was what, 60 years. And I got invited to the rededication. It's too bad that we couldn't identify more of them.
Yeah.
But children grow up, and like I say, some of them have passed away. And it was always packed. The line would be from where the door was all the way around the carousel itself, waiting to get on that, get a ride. Like I say, every time that music started up, the kids would come running from every which way to get on that carousel.
Binghamton-Johnson City in Endicott is famous in the carousel world for having 6 Allen Herschel carousels. We have more carousels in their original area than, as far as we know, any place in the world. They were put here by the founders and the owners of the Endicott-Johnson Shoe Corporation as in the parks for the benefit of their employees and citizens of the community, just for enjoyment. That's the kind of folks the Johnsons were, to make sure that their people were well housed, happy, well fed, and taken care of.
West Endicott had its own park, located on Page Avenue. It had its own carousel as well, the major attraction. George F. also gave West Endicott a $100,000 community center and firehouse. Johnson City was no stranger to recreation either. At the site of a complex of factories sits CFJ Park, built in 1926. It, too, has a carousel. A large in-the-ground pool was the first major attraction. It was later replaced in 1927 with one of the largest out-of-ground pools in the country. The pool had 1.5 million gallons of water from artesian wells filtered and heated to a constant temperature of 72 degrees. What really made the park unique was the CFJ Pavilion. On Friday and Saturday nights, EJ would bring in the best big bands from the era and could be enjoyed for just $1. That entire $1, without any expense deductions, went to the Broome County Humane Society. The pavilion also housed amateur boxing matches and other events.
Everybody was there. Benny Goodman, and you just name every single one of them. And 2 bits to dance. Only those big bands on Friday night. Saturday night was 25 cents to dance. That place was just jammed full of us young teenagers. That was the place to go. For a quarter, and you had to be a a gentleman and a lady that go to that dance there. There was no rowdyism in there, no drinking in there, no drinking in there.
Yes, I used to go every Saturday night to the pavilion at 50 cents to get in. And we used to see all the big name bands. I saw Von Monroe, Louis Prima, Ray McKinley, all the big bands. Yep, and that was $1. That was $1 to get in on that. In fact, Von Monroe and the Moon Maids, I got their autographs. Boy, that was, oh, the pavilion was great. Every Saturday night, no matter if the snow was up to your wazoo, you went to the pavilion. In fact, a lot of my girlfriends met their husbands there. And they only sold hot dogs and soft drinks, no alcoholic beverages. We'd get all dressed up and go see the big name bands.
Friday and Saturday nights. Oh, that big one. Oh, all they do though, yeah, but wasn't much dancing. They just get in front of the bandstand and just jiggle back and forth, so listen to the music. There's all no rowdyism and nothing, everything. Oh, yeah.
In Binghamton, George F. paid $100,000 for land and donated it in 1921 for the construction of Recreation Park. He also installed a carousel and gave an additional $50,000 to help complete the park. George F. also built the Enjoy Golf Course in 1923. It cost just $0.25 to play all day. It was built flat so that the tired worker could relax while playing a game of golf.
If golf's good for the tired businessman, it's good for the worker, too. Keep it on level land, too, all the way. Men and women who have been busy at machines all day don't need to climb the tough hills that make a course sporty.
Even the fire prevention department had its fair share of fun as well. As a cohesive and closely knit group who spent much time together, they all enjoyed each other's company. They were even hosts and role models for 52 children from New York City. The children were housed at the Endicott and Johnson City stations for 2 weeks. The Fresh Air Children, as they were known, played in the parks and spent time in the area's wealth of recreational facilities. Before leaving for their homes in New York City, each child received a new pair of shoes from George F. And if all these activities weren't enough, E.J. under Charles F. Johnson later built 2 recreation centers, one in Johnson City and one in Endicott. Endicott's recreation center, known as West Branch, replaced the old casino building that was Ideal Park's pavilion. The centers, costing $1 million apiece, housed a bowling alley and basketball courts. It was also the site of the famous retirement dinners.
I bowled at the recreation center for years. In fact, all the time that I worked in EJ, I used to bowl at the recreation center, and that's where they used to have the banquets and any goings on.
My own idea is that these things which are done for the benefit of the help, like swimming pools, which affect the morale of the people and indirectly the profits of the company, should be done by the corporation for the good of the business so that all might share in the cost as all share in the benefits.
And on top of all this physical recreation, there was mental recreation with the area's libraries.
Get any books you want, now and always, and send the bill to me. I count the expense mighty little compared to the benefits which are so abundant when one sees the boys and girls and the older ones enjoying the use of the home and the books.
The area's libraries were established by George F. In 1916, he bought a large home on Main Street in Johnson City. He had it converted to a library and community center with a dining room and full kitchen. In 1918, E.J. purchased the Bundy's family home in Endicott and did the same to it. The Bundy family of Bundy Time Recording was joined with International Time Recording, which eventually became IBM. In 1920, George F. built another library with a community center and called it Hillside Center.
We had a library on the north side that, to me, was one of the most important things I remember in my childhood. Because every day on the way home from school, I stopped at the library. And it was in the 100 block of Odell Avenue. Now, to me, this was a beautiful building, and a lot of the things, as you're older, you think they're beautiful. And well, they had a room with a fireplace, and they had story hour. And every single day of the week, I went to the library and got books to come home and read that night. Then behind the library, in the same building, the library was in the front, but in the same building they had a big community room in the back that you could rent if you wanted to have a party. And they had a little kitchen for refreshments.
And for all others who couldn't make it to the library, a traveling library was put into service. After 1925, the villages picked up the tab for the libraries. In addition to the libraries, the George F. Johnson School was built in West Endicott. The school was built for $300,000 and given by George F. to the school district in 1924. Some other area schools were named in tribute of the Johnsons. Most of the Triple Cities churches were supported by George F.
Like I went to the church in West Endicott, Methodist Church, and they had a mortgage, and I remember he paid the mortgage off, and they burnt the mortgage, the paper like that. And
others he built or paid a majority of the construction expenses. George F. and C. Fred built the Sarah Jane Johnson United Methodist Church in 1927 in memory of their mother. St. Joseph's Catholic Church in Endicott's north side is one of the area's many beautiful churches, thanks to George F.
It was built in 1928. I was just a kid myself. We used to go out there and with the pastor, with the priest, and be doing all kinds of pick and shovel work, gardening and landscaping and so on, so working anyway. And Mr. George F. used to drive by, and he'd stop, and he was so happy to see that the priest was working in coveralls. You wouldn't know who the priest was unless you knew who his person he was. He said, "Hey, Mr. Father Billy, I commend you." So he says, "I'll make a deal with you, Father." He says, "I'll match you dollar for dollar for whatever you can raise in a given time." I think it was $28,000 that we raised. His daughter, Lillian Sweet, she belonged to St. Patrick's Church in Binghamton. They gave us the altar, the organ, pipe organ, and the pews.
The beautiful stained glass windows were donated by parish families. Many families had to mortgage their homes to pay for the windows because they signed up to donate them in 1928, and the bills came in 29 when the Depression hit. The Gothic design is perpetuated in the church's woodwork and altar setting. The area's American Legion posts were also built by George F. in the 20s. Post 80 in Binghamton, Post 82 in Endicott, and Post 429 in Johnson City still stand today. Costs totaled $350,000.
And Post 82 down on Riverview Drive, it was a post that my father belonged to. I told you before he was a World War I veteran. Well, this provided a lot of social life for the whole family because everything that they did down there was family, for families. And it was a beautiful building, and there were a lot of men who were in the First World War who belonged to that Legion. And then we got to know kids from all over. It wasn't just from the north side, but kids from, and we remained friends all through the years. And that was a very, very active, that post and their activities was also an active part of the community. Then another important part of the a person's life was the social aspect and the fraternal aspect. George F. Johnson had, he had an insight about the things that were important for immigrants coming to this country. Now, many of our lodges, the Sons of Italy, in different lodges. The land was donated, and sometimes even a lot of the building expense donated by George F. Johnson, by the Endicott-Johnson Corporation. And that was so that people could have this feeling of togetherness, which they also got in the churches.
Also paying respect to those who lost their lives in World War I, George F. erected a monument that still stands today. In addition to the annual George F. Day parades in September, when George F. would come back from spending winters in Florida in May, workers would organize a homecoming parade to show their enthusiasm and gratitude. George F. successfully made a happy family climate for all, both in and out of shop.
The people I worked with were fantastic. In fact, when I left EJ, I cried. Not so much as to that I was leaving the job as I was to leave all the nice people. There was always an excuse for a party. You know, if it was somebody's birthday, you went out to lunch, the whole gang. They thought nothing of having a party right in the department like at Christmas time. Even my boss got dressed up as Santa Claus. I mean, it was, you were like one big happy family. That's what I remember about it.
You always said we were one big happy family, and that was really literally the truth, way back in the good years. In the good years, that was really the truth.
I worked 41 years for the Endicott-Johnson. I worked about 38 years on a tannery. And I was very happy. The people, they was nice. We was like a brother and sister in there.
We had workers working 50, 60 years. They come here, most of the immigrants that come in here went to work at 12, 13, 14 years old. And they never retired, they just worked, like I say, for 40, 50, 60 years.
So I started to work June 7th, 1948. And of course, you started way down low. I started on a freight gang. I must have worked maybe 4 years on the freight gang, and I enjoyed every minute of it.
George F. knew he needed more than healthy and happy employees to have success. Considering that all of the benefits mentioned were paid by 2 1/4 cents added to each pair of shoes, obviously EJ was making a lot of shoes. They were making a working man's shoe for a working man's dollar. Their motto was better shoes for less money, and they were. George F.'s manufacturing integration from hoof to foot was most appreciated when cost savings were considered. Even the rubber heels and later rubber soles used in shoe production were made by EJ. EJ had its own rubber mill where it bought rubber stock and made it into heels and soles. George F. had the idea of having a rubber reclamation plant where acres of old tires would be used for making new rubber for shoes, one of the first companies to use post-consumer waste for production of new goods. Production jobs at EJ were highly secure during the 20s. George F. became chairman of the board, and presidency was then occupied by his son, George W., in 1930. George W. had the luxury of being able to continue on with his father's programs. And as time wore on during the Depression, one more thing was different in the Triple Cities. EJ did not lay off one single worker. He was able to do this by reducing each worker's hours. Again, the greatest good for the greatest number rang true. Back then, George W. and George F. chose this option because they realized that with no jobs, there's no consumers, something that corporations of today still don't seem to understand. Columbina is especially grateful because she was actually hired during the Depression.
My husband said, why don't you help my wife to get a job? And he say, but you see, I don't even have work for those girls I got here. You know, it's really, we don't have much work. We was working, even my husband, he was working about 3 half a days a week. But finally, after a couple weeks or so, I got a job on a tannery work at about 2-3 half a days a week.
It was perhaps the most well-off community in the country during the Depression.
They was making shoes and they warehousing them just to keep the people working. They was working, my father worked in a tannery. Some weeks they get $6 a week, $7, but he made good money an hour, see, probably 75, 80 cents an hour, see, something like that. And they keep the factories running, making the shoes and warehousing them. Then when things broke, they would sell them, see. But George F., he had a generous heart.
But they never wanted to lay anybody off. There's, okay, we got just that much work, we're going to divide it up, and everybody will get something anyway. So, in one of these speeches that he had, he says, well, he told the workers, he says, not to worry. He says, as long as babies are born barefooted, EJ will stay in business. All the school kids and teachers, within a radius of 50 miles, free pair of shoes of their choice. And they also had a Christmas party every year for all the school kids in the Triple Cities. And the boys would all get a sleigh and the girls would get a doll, plus all the goodies they had to eat there and everything. But this free pair of shoes every Christmas with all the teachers and the kids in the Triple Cities. And further than that, 50-mile radius. I don't know how far they went. What a nice sight that used to be. See, teachers walking down the sidewalk, the whole classroom, you know, all going down carrying the shoebox. It used to be really a nice sight. It was a really nice sight.
It's my understanding that all the boys took the high cuts because a knife used to be included on the side of the high cut, you know, the high boots, maybe they were 8-inch boot. And anybody you talk to who was raised in those days would tell you, oh, them high cuts. Everybody loved the high cuts.
He had been class conscious as a young man in Massachusetts, but he was a very bright and successful young man and achieved success as a capitalist, first as a foreman and then working his way up in management until he owned a substantial share of the company itself. And part of reconciling the fact that he was now a successful capitalist but had been a socialist was to arrive at this sort of a synthesis of the two movements, at least in his mind, welfare capitalism, a way of making sure that you continue to amass profits, but at the same time show some responsibility to your workers. And that was the compromise that he reached. And that's probably why it was more substantial than other firms that were doing it for purely pragmatic or didn't have this background, this ideological background that he had.
In 1937, George F. resigned from chairman of the board due to health reasons. George W. took his place as chairman, and later Charles F. Johnson Jr. stepped in as president. Before the Depression, EJ was producing 175,000 pairs of shoes a day with 20,000 employees in over 30 facilities stretching from Owego to Binghamton. But this was an era of the second phase of the Depression. Cost and benefit cutting were implemented. Employees were becoming less satisfied after being accustomed to previous benefits. The penetration of unions seemed entirely possible with the weakened employee-employer relationship. The AFL and CIO unions were organizing in other local boot and shoe companies. When it came time for EJ to vote on the unions in 1939, 80% of the workforce that voted were against the unions. Times would get better, and EJ recovered with the Second World War's need for military boots. Nevertheless, the union organizers were relentless in their attempts to unionize EJ, who was desperate for workers during wartime.
The occasion is officially called a Loyalty and Appreciation Dinner, and those two words sum up the whole spirit of the meeting. Noted throughout his brilliant career for his progressive policies, which have been applied particularly to improving working conditions, Mr. Johnson is deservedly called a great humanitarian. Orchids for Mrs. Johnson, who shares in the honors of her distinguished husband. Loved for her various charities, Mrs. Johnson has been voted the First Lady of Endicott by Mr. Johnson's employees.
Now permitted to say a few words for everything you have done that has made everything that I have done I want you to understand. Maybe some of you don't believe it. It might sound better if some of you said it, but I've never been a gold digger. Let the other fellows dig the gold. And I don't want to be glorified. I admit to you frankly, and repeat again, I couldn't have done anything worthwhile on my own. You made everything possible, and so I owe you all that I am and all that I hope to be as long as God lets me live.
Some feel that the loyalty was not only bred through the good of EJ, but requested of workers in return, and therefore created a false sense of industrial democracy.
Part of the loyalty was a pragmatic loyalty. It was a recognition that in America at the time, there were few companies that gave you these type of benefits. And and there were good reasons to remain in the community and remain employed by the company and be, quote, a good employee. You were getting a lot, much more than other firms were giving you. And so there was that aspect of the loyalty. The other thing is that when you look at the dynamics, the interactions between managers and workers on the shop floor on a daily basis, it was a give and take situation. It wasn't simply they were passively accepting anything that management decided to throw their way on the shop floor. They were actually struggling on a daily basis, and it was that struggle on that level that I was very much interested in documenting, and that I tried to do in both my article and my book. And that struggle took the place, I mean, even on basic things like loyalty petitions, whenever a union organizer would come into town and try to organize, and they came periodically. They came in the 1890s, and they came in the first decade of the century, in the second decade of the century, and then much more energetically in the 1930s with the rise of the CIO. But whenever they would come into town, the company, of course, would try to elicit the loyalty of its workers, and sometimes it would come in the form of loyalty petitions that workers would sign and send up to management. But when I looked at the loyalty petitions and the whole phenomenon of loyalty petitions, they were more of an orchestrated performance within the corporation. Yes, there were a few very loyal workers who might have led them, but they had the cooperation or the involvement of the foreman and the supervisors, and many of them were initiated by management. So it's not, and in fact I have original sources from the corporation itself showing that they kept account of who was signing the loyalty petition, who wasn't, where it was, in which room it was circulated. So it was a very regulated type of activity. For all of the ethic of welfare capitalism about partnership, the belief in developing a partnership, in reality it wasn't about partnership. It was about control by management. When I looked at Endicott-Johnson, what I saw was that there's this facade of partnership and industrial democracy. But because of the relationship on the shop floor, because work was very hierarchically arranged in Endicott-Johnson and throughout the country, of course, under a system of capitalism, they were never able to achieve that ideal of a partnership. It didn't exist. Workers continued to call those above them bosses and think of them that way. And they expressed loyalty, but what type of loyalty are we talking about? It's a pragmatic loyalty, a negotiated loyalty. In addition to the Pinkerton folks, Johnson also had what were called special workers, or workers engaged in special work. And if you look at some of the employment records, and I have a stack of them to my left here, if you look through them, you might come across an occasional one marked special work, and then there's no details about that. And we have an oral interview with one such worker talking about how he had a special phone number that he would call to, if something was up, he would call and get information on what management wanted him to do from that special phone number. Pinkerton agents that were hired by the company, they would send them around to go door to door to act as sales people of various sorts, and to go into bars and just and strike up a conversation with the workers, basically to get a sense of what was on workers' minds, whether they were talking union or not, whether just their concerns of the workers, and keep management in touch with that. The fact that they had to hire them suggests that our concept of open door or constant exchange between managers and workers is a false one. I mean, clearly, if they were concerned about getting this information, they weren't in constant contact.
Despite the anti-union sermons given at the churches George F. helped to build, the unions did get in. The threat and limited penetration of unions into EJ was discouraging to the Johnsons. The fact that they had tried so hard, maybe even too hard, to cure the social ills of the Industrial Revolution was perhaps too much to take when the unions got into one of the tanneries. To see his industrial democracy challenged this seriously was a blow that deteriorated George F.
The unions had come into the area. They wanted to get into the factories because, well, they wanted the power. And he was living in Florida at the time, and he was listening to the radio, and it came over the radio that the one factory had accepted them. And he just turned it off, walked up the stairs, and had a heart attack right on the stairs. And that was his physical downfall from then on.
And it's ironic that here in this bastion of loyalty, in one of the more conservative areas in upstate New York, you would have a communist-led union successfully unionizing tannery workers in this community. That struck me at the time, and in fact got me involved in other projects looking at where communists were able to successfully unionize. But I had to figure out why this was happening, and part of it was because of the nature of the union. It was a very good union, very clean union, as unions go. But also part of it came out of the work culture of the workers among whom they successfully organized, and the tannery workers. Tannery work was a really tough. It's really tough work. I mean, you're working around caustic chemicals with very heavy hides. It's very unpleasant work, and in fact, there are all kinds of diseases associated with that kind of work. And the conditions, the ideology of welfare capitalism didn't seem to penetrate as deeply among this group of workers.
I can remember going through the tannery with him, and there were catwalks between the vats of the lye or whatever it was that took the hair off the skins. It was one of the most awful stenches that you can possibly imagine. And I went to put my fingers up to my nose as I walked through, and he turned around. He would have slapped me, except that we were on these catwalks, and he said, "Young lady, you don't do that around here. That is your bread and butter." Yeah. And you became accustomed to it. You could, like anything else, you can become accustomed to it.
Well, I started in a couple of times. I saw that the floor was all wet. I said, my God, I'm going to slip and fall here. And then you had that smell in the tannery, which was rampant throughout the whole north side of Endicott. You knew. In fact, my brother-in-law, when he used to come home, I used to know where he used to walk because, well, Leo was here.
And you could always tell a home, by the way, if an EJ worker owned a house, because the house just smelled like EJ. Especially our dad worked in a tannery, and he'd have to come in, go right downstairs, take his clothes off, and shower, and hang his clothes in a special room because that was the EJ tannery room.
Permeated the house.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But in the late 40s, EJ employees pulled out of the Red Unions, whose power was cut substantially by the Taft-Hartley Act.
As far as I was concerned, and many, many other people, we just felt that we had no reason to have a union here. But they kept fighting, agitating. And then we voted them out. They did vote them out. They voted them out. And we never needed one in the first place because we got, at that time, I believe we were about as highest paid employees as there were
in that line of business. I couldn't compare myself with IBM wages. No how.
If you want a union, we can leave. There's another community that wants jobs, and in fact, that's what happened. But if I can just read a selection from my book, from a memo. This is while the company was while the tanneries were unionized, the corporation sent some scouts down into Pennsylvania because they were looking to expand factories in Pennsylvania. And the memo that was sent to one of their scouts makes it clear what their intention was. And I hope I can pronounce the Pennsylvania. Tunkhannock is not, this is the community they were looking to establish a factory in. Tunkhannock is not too far away from Johnson City, approximately 45 miles. And if we started a factory and later found ourselves in a position where organized labor will expect to get the same earnings and benefits as our workers in Johnson City, we, of course, would find that our purpose in starting the factory would have been defeated. They're admitting right there, the purpose in starting the factory in Pennsylvania was to defeat unions, to get away from the unions, which had successfully unionized the tanneries. They did the same thing in Mississippi, and they did the same thing in Puerto Rico when they established factories. They were getting away from the unions. They were getting away from a situation where management had lost control.
George F. Johnson passed away on November 28, 1948. Over 10,000 people entered George F.'s home to pay their last respects to the one man who made their life worth living. The family had plans for calling hours to be from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m., but when the crowd showed no signs of dissipating, the calling hours had to be extended until the morning of the funeral. That day, all commerce and industry closed and schools let out. George W. and Mr. Charlie told all employees, some 18,500 of them, that they could consider themselves honorary pallbearers. People couldn't think of how to express their sorrow and gratitude or recount all that he had done.
It is certain, of course, that the passing of George F. Johnson will stir up in the minds of the people of these communities the many experiences of which they have felt the goodness and generosity of this man. But any attempt by me to recount these accomplishments in the fields of human relationships would be meager and totally inadequate.
The funeral, held at Enjoy Park, was the most attended funeral of a private citizen in the history of the United States. Over 40,000 people were in attendance, and many more people heard it on the radio as it was broadcast on Mutual, NBC, ABC, and CBS local affiliates.
I couldn't even go to the funeral, I felt so bad.
In 1951, a memorial monument in tribute of Mr. George F. was dedicated on his birthday 3 years after his death. A beautiful ceremony broadly recounted the many blessings George F. bestowed upon the area and its people.
For many years, our shoe workers and friends in this valley have honored the late Mr. George F. Johnson on his birthday, October 14th. Today it is a pleasure to welcome so many more, joining with us in the unveiling ceremony of this memorial monument.
Almighty God, behold this statue and exedraw. We pause to honor the memory of him for whom we now dedicate these works of art. George F. Johnson, for his courage, vision, and wisdom, for his charity and charitableness, for his spirit of pioneering, his will to build our town, for his encouragement of a new way of living, for the very mighty work he has done in our day, that we might live more securely, labor more abundantly, play more healthfully, and enjoy each other more contentedly. We give heartfelt thanks for the friendship and leadership of this great man. We thank thee, our Father, for George F. Johnson. May his soul rest eternally with thee in peace. Through Jesus Christ our Lord we ask this. Amen.
It is a high privilege and great honor to have a part in the dedication of this beautiful memorial to the most widely known, biggest-hearted, best-loved man that has lived, labored, and died in this lovely valley of opportunity. Of him it can be truthfully said, none knew thee but to love thee, nor name thee but to praise. Every resident, every business concern, every religious denomination, every charitable organization in this valley is a beneficiary of the labor and his generosity. Only he and the recording angels know the extent and magnitude of his benefactions, public and private, but they totaled millions. Much, if not most, of George F.'s success stemmed from and was the fruit of his understanding of, affection for, and faith in his fellow workers. That they loved him was demonstrated when, by an overwhelming, nearly unanimous vote, they repudiated the malicious, libelous lies about him and his family and his company, which outside organizers had flooded the valley in their efforts to unionize his company, and which nearly broke his heart and his health. It did break his health, and it did break his heart. A more impressive, heartwarming demonstration of workers' devotion and loyalty to their leader has never been given.
While I'm in the position this afternoon of representing all the people in the community, I desire to pay my personal tribute to the man whose friendship and encouragement meant so much to me when I started to develop an industry in Endicott. I shall always cherish in my heart his kindness, his encouragement, and his friendship, which I appreciate beyond my ability to express in words. His business policies, his high ideals, and his appreciation of the duties of a good citizen have helped to develop our community into one of the most outstanding communities in our whole country. We all owe a great debt of gratitude to the memory of George F. Johnson, which we can pay in full measure by perpetuating and passing on to future generations his high business, moral, and spiritual standards, which have been proven to be of such great benefit to all of us.
Most of you knew Mr. Johnson. All of you have benefited by his gifts and his generosity. Again, thank Almighty God. You know he was a great leader. He was a great genius. Not only did he build factories and get business going in the southern tier, but here is something he did that stands out in his life as a marvelous man. He raised up young men to take his place after Almighty God had called him out of this world. Again, thank Almighty God for this, and thank him because these young men, who were young men then, are carrying on the work in a marvelous manner.
It would remain to be seen just how marvelous future generations would handle the challenges that lie ahead. Nephew Charles F. Johnson, Jr., known as Mr. Charlie to the public, was a simple man who loved the employees and didn't care about the conditions and warning signs.
He was a very good person, I think. I always thought so anyway. I enjoyed working for him and for the whole family. I worked for all of them at times. He thought the world of the workers. That was his whole life, practically. He tried to do all they could for them. We worked hard, but I mean, I didn't mind that. I enjoyed it. And it wasn't, it was not a routine job. You never know what was going to do the next day, really, lots of times. But it was fun. It was a good job. He was a nice man to work for.
Mr. Charlie felt on top of the world and invincible in a time where it was least appropriate. American business trends were transforming from a sales economy to a marketing economy that was globally competitive. The market be damned was his perspective.
That they didn't progress after grandfather died. They didn't progress as much as they should have.
Endicott-Johnson was manufacturing oriented. That kind of company usually operates on the premise that if you make more of something than anybody else, you'll make it cheaper. And consequently, you'll be able to sell it cheaper and give the people a better product for less money. That was George F.'s philosophy. Better shoes for less money. That was their slogan. And his philosophy was, I'm going to make all the shoes in the United States, and I'm going to make them cheaper than anybody and better than anybody. And of course, that philosophy was a very successful philosophy in the Depression, which was when the George F. flourished. His whole company really grew and was very successful in the Depression years. After the Depression, of course, we went through a social revolution in the country. During the Depression years, when people were poor, they all wanted, the brand names were very impressive to the people, but they couldn't afford them. We come out of the Army, and now everybody wants brand name merchandise. They want Bostonians, and they want Hartshafner Marks, and they want Botanies, and they want Florsheim. They don't want better shoes for less money. They want people to think they're somebody. They want to have what they think is brand name. They want recognition. And so Endicott-Johnson, now George F. in the meantime has phased out of this, and Charles Johnson took over, and he didn't recognize that in this era, it's not better shoes for less money. It's you had to have marketing expertise. And so we proceeded during that period of time under Charles Johnson to try to make more shoes, better shoes for less money. And of course it wasn't working. And of course the situation got worse. Now the Korean War kind of postponed our demise because that gave us a spurt for making, and all other shoe companies got big contracts. So it took a lot of the production capacity out of the stream, and that made Endicott-Johnson get them a little more time. But nevertheless, it was not a good philosophy because it wasn't going to work. So the company started downhill naturally. Their profits were shrinking, and they weren't doing well.
Charlie continued on with the company's benefits and added more at a time when the company needed to tighten its belt. After paying $1, many employees and area residents loosened their belts to eat and party all night at the company's several retirement dinners held at the recreation centers.
He gave every retiree $75 at the dinners, and we had a history of each one written up, and gave them a book with all the histories in them at each retirement dinner. They liked ham dinners, very much. And we got so tired of ham dinners, we tried to get some chicken dinners, and we finally get a few in, now and then, because we had to go every Saturday night to dinners. So the ham was getting a little tiresome. Mrs. Johnson did the same thing. She got tired of it, too.
But he had those ham parties those big parties every Saturday night. And you paid $1 or something, and you go all the beer you want and all that. And all that movement was to keep the union. We're a happy family. We don't, we don't need the outsiders type of thing.
They had retirement parties every year. Every factory was brought in, and their factory had their particular party for all those who had been retired. And people from IBM used to come up to the parties. And they used to always laugh about the fact that when most of the IBMers come up to the party, they would bring a doggy bag along. They would fill up their doggy bags and take them back with them.
All the eats you want, hams and everything imaginable. Eat, drink, and be merry, dance till midnight. And there again, too, that wasn't limited to EJ workers. That was out to the public. And our neighbors, again, were there in full force. It was a cheap night for them to take their wife out, you know, for a buck. Eat, get loaded, and then dance it off. I don't blame them a bit.
And what could very well have been a last meal with their families, draftees for the Korean War had breakfast at the recreation center. A picture was taken with the family, friends, and Mr. Charlie. In some cases, it would be the last picture of the family together.
They gave each GI a shoebox.
You give them a shoebox, and it was full of a lot of little
carton of cigarettes. And
no, they would have like soap and toiletries, a razor blade, toothbrush, and all that kind of stuff, and box lunch too. Because we would go on the bus and we would take us up to Syracuse to get sworn in. So, but he have a breakfast for his family, and
every one of the men every group that left had a breakfast for them, and gave them a little gift, things they could use, you know. And I think he gave the scripture to the press. I'm Sunbolden, I mean, not the press.
In addition, the costs of the old benefits were getting out of hand.
You know, doctor would say, "Oh, how are you today?" or "What's your problem?" And they'd say, "No, I'm all right, doc. I need tape, bandages." Oh yeah. It had gone downhill, and a stitching room where all these women congregate. Oh, you know, you could just look down rows and rows and rows. And again, here's misuse of drugs, dexedrine. The word got around if you took speed, fast, because each rack was a coupon. It was piecework. You cut the coupon. The more you did, the more pay you got. The misuse of the dexedrine, the spanchules, Secanol for sleep, Nambutal. I think about it now. The drug problem, we had it then. Bad, I mean. Some of the medicine that some of these people took was unbelievable. They had to have something to get up in the morning with, something to go to sleep with. Where would you question? Because, you know, here was the directive coming saying, give them what they want. Okay, give them what maybe that was one of their problems, the downfall. Give them what they want. They went into the red. Sick relief came in there. You applied for sick relief. And they got paid while they were home sick. Then this got misused. You'd go to the dinner, and who's up there dancing away and having a ball? So I would come back, if it was my turn to work, and I saw this, I'd come back and Dr. Clemo, so-and-so was really kicking up his heel. Oh, yeah? Okay, I'll fix him. Okay? Yeah? Oh, yeah.
Regardless of the fact that the company was headed steadily downhill, Charlie borrowed money to continue building the homes to sell at cost.
They went to visit at least 3 or 4 houses every Sunday. Took a cameraman and visited with the people and then see how things were going, how they liked their house and things like that. He went out there to quail hunt with the fellows from the St. Louis department. And he was awfully tired when he left to go there. He'd been running around all the factories, and he was really tired out when he left, and I think he was just too tired, and I don't know, but anyway, he got out there and had a stroke. Right soon after he got there, I think.
Within 2 years of the stroke, Mr. Charlie passed away. George W.'s son, Frank A. Johnson, would follow, and wished that he too could continue on forever with the countless benefits that the company had.
See, where's all that gone?